Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the North Andover. Oops, I've got to stop this first. There we go. Hello, welcome to the North Andover Historical Society, Stevens Center on the Commons, and the Worden Theater. We're so glad you joined us this evening for Speaker Dan Gagnon's talk, A Salem Witch. And I will introduce Dan in just a minute. I'm Lynn Wenzel, and I am the bookstore manager of the 1646 bookstore, and also I work as part of booking the speakers for the Historical Society. You may have noticed that there's a lot happening in this building. Please check out our Child's Play exhibit in the History Wing and the 1646 bookstore for a selection of books and merchandise. If you also saw Diane's Cafe on the Common is a welcoming spot for coffee and a bite to eat, and it's open Wednesday to Sunday. So I want to remind everybody of safety and courtesy considerations before we get started. So please put your cell phones and any other noisemakers into silent mode during the program. Please refrain from any eating or drinking in the theater other than water. Bathrooms are through the boardroom and on the right. And please be sure if you use the bathroom to shut the door when you're done so that the fans don't interrupt the speaker. In case of emergency, the main exit is back through the theater where you came and out the front door, but there's also an emergency exit over on my left past the organ. Also thank you to our partner, North Andover Cam. Thank you, Brian. So they are recording this talk for rebroadcast for those unable to attend in person. And just please be aware that we are recording during the presentation. So if you want to ask a question, be aware that you may be on broadcast. So we have some exciting programs coming out at the Stevens Center. So we have a program, a partnership with the local theater group Acting Out. So there's a monthly theater series that'll be here starting Saturday, April 20th at 2 p.m. It is a organized table read of a one-act play by a local playwright. So that is called Suspended Lives, and that will be every month. And a solar symposium on Thursday, April 25th at 7 p.m. for Earth Week. Our educator, David Blauvelt, will be doing School Vacation Week programs. So if you have kids or grandkids that are interested in history, that is April 17th through the 19th. And we're working on a speaker for May. So check out our website to register and for additional programs as they're added, and follow us on Facebook. So no nonprofit can function without financial support of members and friends. So we want to thank those of you that donated through our ticketing site. There's a donation box in the lobby area when you exit, and we thank you so much for your support for our programs. We encourage you to become a member if you're not already, and membership applications are in the lobby as well. So let me introduce our speaker for this evening. Historian Dan Gagnon is the author of Salem Witch, The Trial, Execution, and Exoneration of Rebecca Nurse. He serves on the board of directors of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum in Danvers, is a member of the Danvers Historical Society, and is chairman of the Town of Danvers Salem Village Historic District Commission. He has shared his research through many in-person and online programs, including C-SPAN's television program, American History TV, and has served as a subject matter expert for local media. If you caught Dan on the way in, we are selling copies of his book, and we'll have them out in the conference room outside. You can purchase a book, and Dan will be happy to autograph it or personalize it for you after the presentation. So let me cue up Dan's PowerPoint and introduce Dan. Thank you, Dan. All right, we should be up in 1 second. There we go. I'm going to walk out of here and do this.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lynn. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Awesome. Good. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm happy you've all come out to hear about the story of Rebecca Nurse and the Salem witch trials. By day, I'm a high school teacher, and I like to sort of roam at the front of my classroom, but I know tonight I have to be kind of anchored next to the microphone. This is a little bit different for me. I am very happy to see you all and to have such a great turnout. You can imagine in terms of interest and history, this is an interesting historical event in that it has a season, which is not really historically true, but you can imagine the fall is really big time for books such as this, for events. And so it's always wonderful when I can talk to people about this, not in October, because it has nothing to do with October, but that is when everybody comes to Salem and wants to hear about it. So it's truly wonderful to see you. My book, my only book, is A Salem Witch, which is a biography of Rebecca Nurse. She's one of the 19 who was hanged for witchcraft in 1692 in Salem. With my work, as Lynn had mentioned, I had been involved with Rebecca Nurse Homestead for many years. It was actually my first job as a high schooler, was just selling tickets. And so to me, being from Danvers, right down the road from the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, this really is like our local history, and that's what had gotten me so interested in it. When I had first started talking to people about the book, when I knew the book was going to come out, I had a good response, fortunately, and I often got a question or a comment, depending on how it was phrased. Why one more book about the witch trials? Aren't there already a bunch of books about the witch trials? And this is true, and many of them are very good. What I had seen missing in all of the historical work about the witch hunt is there was not on the market any standalone full biography of one person. There's much work out there that deals with one town, or it deals with the economic influences, or a book about like the social influences. But this event is really, really big in terms of number of people involved in the 1692 witch hunt. And through many of these books, although that they are excellent, they try to be all-encompassing, and the people really fall through the cracks. They really just become like a detail to this bigger story. With the event overall, you have 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, at least 5 died in jail. We have almost 200 people accused. This is a lot of people already. And then if you try to tell the full story of everybody, you then get into the people who defended those who were accused, like another 100 people. Those who accused them, another 100 people. And eventually the story just gets too big. And so my focus was to narrowly show one person's life and show how this event really is a tragedy and how it really affected human lives. While going into the causes and reasons, but to show how one person, or really one family, because her family is a big part of the story too, how they are touched by this. With the story of Nurse herself, okay, good. Our story centers primarily in Salem Village, which is what is primarily today the town of Danvers. Rebecca Nurse herself, her story does not begin here, though. Rebecca Nurse is a first-generation settler coming from England. She is born in the east coast of England, kind of like opposite the channel from the Netherlands, in 1621. So by the time the witch hunt comes, she's a 71-year-old woman, and she has already been through a lot in her life. With Rebecca Nurse and most of the other people in Salem Village, in Salem, in the whole Massachusetts Bay Colony, they're primarily Puritans, and that's really the main reason that they came over to Massachusetts, is to practice the Puritan religion. It's the reason they came, but it's also the reason they left, as they were persecuted in England. Being a Puritan was not really within the law, according to the Church of England. So we know that her family in Great Yarmouth, England, really would have suffered persecution just due to those unallowed religious beliefs. When they come over here, what's really fascinating is we have, for some who arrive in Massachusetts, excellent records. And then for other Puritans, we really don't. In part, many of the Puritans who left England didn't necessarily do so legally, and so we don't really have a paper trail. So narrowing down when Rebecca Nurse first came across the ocean, really has to do with other evidence. We know when her father's name is first mentioned as owning land. We know when it was last mentioned in England, and we can kind of piece together within a year, the year 1635, that she would have arrived here. With her family, they are fairly typical for Massachusetts Puritans. And I think this really adds to her story when she's accused of witchcraft, because she really seems so ordinary and is somebody who, unfortunately, at the time, probably would not have been remembered, or we would have very few documents with her name on it if it was not for the witch trials. She's someone who really would have flown under the radar, so to speak, just as an upstanding member of Puritan society. With our map in front of you here, so the bottom right is downtown Salem. You can see the port there with more of a road and some buildings in there. This is a nice 19th century map by Charles Upham, who lived in Salem. And with her life, she marries at a typical age to a gentleman, Francis Nurse. Her maiden name is Town. She becomes Rebecca Nurse upon marriage. Then later on, they're going to move out to Salem Village. With the village, there's a giant letter C right next to the Roman numeral 16. That's the center of Salem Village, and then the letter D is right near where the Rebecca Nurse homestead is, where her family moved to. So they're here in the center of Salem Village. We have a lot of misconceptions about the events of 1692 in terms of where they occur. Like I said, in October, everybody goes to downtown Salem. And although significant, and yes, events did happen in downtown Salem, it's not incorrect, really the village within the dark black lines is the heart of our story. By the time Nurse and her husband moved to Salem Village, they have been married for a couple decades. They have 8 children. They move in 1678 to that farm in the village. And with their beginnings, especially as they're raising their family, and 8 children was fairly typical at that point in time, they are really not well off. There was an interpretation of Rebecca Nurse's case from the 1800s that had to do, basically, it was simply they accused her of witchcraft because people were jealous of her economic success. And through my looking at the documents, tax records, and valuations, there was really nothing to envy here, unfortunately. They had only rented land, we think, prior to that. I had come across them owning at least a parcel of land that was given to them by the city of Salem, way out west inland. It would have been less desirable. Today you can't really go see it. It's right where 128 and 95 split in that giant Y. That's where their first land would have been. I hate to use a modern landmark to describe that. It's a terrible landmark. But when they moved to Salem Village, it's the first time they're able to own themselves a farm. And this is important as a status symbol, but it's also really just important for the economic security of their whole family. And the reason they can pull it off is because many of her children were either approaching adulthood or were adults at that point, and they could contribute. It's an extended family purchase, really. Her husband is the one whose name is on the mortgage, but we know that her sons are contributing. And soon afterwards, it was subdivided where 3 of her sons are living there with her. So they have this little unit of the Nurse family there, 4 houses together, and the other siblings are not far away, in downtown Salem, in North Reading, and in nearby communities here. And once the Nurse family moves to the village, that's really what sets into play the chain of events that leads to the witch hunt. Had they stayed in downtown Salem, they may not have been involved in the witch hunt, or perhaps in a radically different sort of way. It's this community where the problem is. And I think on my next slide I had, my A+ Microsoft Paint artistic talent. Within the blue lines is the town of Danvers. So the black top, black bottom, blue left, blue right does get us that. So you can see it's mostly that community, but it does extend over most of the way from Danvers to here into what's Middleton as well. With the village and the Nurse family's home, here we have the farm in Danvers. Salem Village has a lot of issues, and this began prior to the nurses arriving. They will become involved just as citizens of Salem Village. Salem Village, number one among its issues, wanted to become a separate town from what we think of today as the city of Salem, back then the town of Salem. Being a village, they had been given an amount of autonomy in that they had their own church, but the town of Salem was not going to give them permission to leave and start their own town. Salem had lost a lot of land to Beverly, to Wenham, way back to Marblehead and such. They wanted no more splits. They gave them permission for the church really only because it was a walk for hours to attend church every Sunday from some parts of Salem Village, and there was just a practical level that you couldn't really get past that. That was an actual problem for people. With the village as it is, it has its own committee that's elected. Because it's not a town, they don't call it the selectmen, but it's similar in that regard. They made decisions based on their own village town meeting, and Rebecca Nurse's husband is going to be important here in the village. One way the Nurse family had also been portrayed prior to my research, especially in the 1970s, is that they were newcomers, essentially people from the city that were coming out into this more rural area. And that really isn't the case, since the only place they had land before this was really inland, just farmland. They weren't coming from downtown. They were farmers, just like the rest of Salem Village was all farmers. And there really isn't any sort of like social divide that they fall against those who would have accused them, who we'll get to in just a moment. The number one source of conflict in the village is over that church, which is the one sort of institution that makes Salem Village separate and makes it Salem Village. The village had a lot of trouble with a whole string of ministers. We had Reverend Paris during the witch hunt, and we had 3 prior to him. The 3 prior to him, there's a combination of either quitting in a huff and leaving or almost being driven out of town. This community is very divisive over its preachers. And some of it is, they thought some of them wanted to be paid too much. Others had like personal conflict. We have some disagreements over preaching. That really isn't the number one issue. And the issue about money is important because the Salem Village government exists to collect taxes for the village meeting house. I have a picture in a second. And for the minister's salary. So you could not be any more entwined with your local political issues and your local religious issues here. With Reverend Paris, when he arrives in 1689, we know that the Nurse family is involved in hiring him, whereas, again, several decades back, they had been portrayed as, socially against the longtime Salem Village people, against Reverend Paris. There is no evidence prior to the witch hunt that shows that to be true. We have Rebecca's husband, Francis, on a committee that wants to hire him. And Reverend Paris takes so long negotiating with that committee that they have to pick a second one. And one of her sons-in-law who lives on the farm with her, he's on that committee. So clearly the extended family is on board with Reverend Paris. Paris is unusual in Salem Village. He is not from there. He had come by way of Barbados, where his father and uncle owned an extraordinarily lucrative plantation full of slaves. And because they had a lot of money, they could pay to send him to Boston to go to Harvard. Family money ran out, and he has to drop out of Harvard. So his dream of being educated and he wanted to be a wealthy merchant really doesn't pan out. So being a minister is his fallback career. It's an unusual one to have as a fallback. But he had been an assistant at a church in Boston, and this is his first real job. This is his first independent posting. Probably not what he had in mind, since Salem Village is truly the backwoods, middle of nowhere, and he would have known about the problems with the 3 prior ministers. So not his pick. But also Salem Village doesn't really have a lot of opportunity to pick. We don't know that anybody else applied for the job. He's the only one we know who applied. So they really may not have had a choice in any way. And the other reason they probably didn't have a choice that we can kind of gather is because he negotiates really hard. He kind of knows that they're desperate and wants to be paid really well in a way that it's probably above what they could have afforded, but they do. With the Nurse family, they would have attended the Salem Village Meeting House Puritan Church. Prior to that, they'd, of course, attended in downtown Salem when they lived closer to downtown Salem. And Rebecca Nurse herself is an important figure among the women in the Puritan Church. So in the 17th century, not everybody, but almost everybody, would have attended religious services in the meeting house with the minister every Sunday. One Sunday out of the month, they had what they called the Lord's Supper, essentially their communion service. They didn't do it every week, just once a month. And only a select few were allowed to be a part of that, sort of like the inner core of the church. The inner core, in order to become a full member of the church, you needed to be, well, in a logistical sense, voted in by all the other members and with the minister's approval. But in order to get that, you needed to tell them that you had had a divine revelation yourself in order to get in. And so there's very few. It's about, each town is different, but the statistic you hear for overall Massachusetts is only about 10% of the people are in this core group of the Puritan Church. Now, Nurse is, and that is really in society the highest position, the highest respect that a 17th century woman could attain. They couldn't serve an elected office like her husband, and so being recognized by the church is really significant. And it also really sets her up as being such an unlikely person to be accused. Prior to 1692, we don't have anybody of that full church member status who they would call visible saints. We have no inclination that anybody of them had been accused of witchcraft prior to the Salem witch hunt, because it doesn't really make sense. By becoming that member, the community is recognizing that they're assuming that you are destined for heaven, that because you had to relate that divine experience, that's what they took that to mean. The Puritans believed in predestination, which is it was already decided at the end of your life if you're going up or you're going down. And with that, the church members are those that they were really convinced were destined for heaven, not someone you think would be accused of witchcraft. So we have her set up as a very ordinary Puritan in a certain degree, but also one who is well respected within the church. This story doesn't seem like it's going wrong at this point in time. In fact, this seems really good that she is making a success. She has a healthy family. They've at least started to own land. They're behind on their mortgage payments, so it's not really economic success, but they're trying. And things do seem to be finally picking up for the Nurse family after they had fled England. We know that this will not continue. Reverend Parris himself will be a key figure in the witch hunt. We have his sermons from his time. At least the first 5 years are published in a volume, but there are others that exist as primary source documents. And Parris's style of preaching is, one that I think the 21st century reader would think is kind of dark and gloomy, but that was kind of the movement at the time of all Puritan ministers. He's really not exceptional. But you hear these sermons about watch out, don't commit anything wrong, the devil is always there to trip you up. The devil is always trying to bring down Massachusetts in particular, because that's the Puritan colony, and of course they believe Puritanism was the best, naturally. They believe that they always had to be on guard, that if the devil was going to mess with anybody, it was them, because they were like the good guys in this story, essentially. And the devil is always trying to go after the people who it's hardest to try to go after, was their belief. Parris himself factors into our story, along with Nurse's husband, over a piece of land. This is where the parsonage was, the minister's house that was also paid for by the local government, the local tax. And so Nurse's husband ends up on the village committee like the selectmen, and their job is after hiring the minister, collecting the taxes and such. The home, as you see, of course, it is long gone. It had been an archaeological dig in the 1970s, and so this is what remains of it. When Parris is hired, he wanted to own land, because again, he had come from wealth. It's a sign of status. And he wants to own the parsonage, which is a really wild ask. In almost every single community, the parsonage is community property. It's like public land. It's like town hall. It's owned by the town, and the minister's allowed to live there just while he has the job. This had been a fight. Paris lost this fight. His contract did not have that. And time goes on. From 1689, we have about 2.5 years until we get to the witch hunt. And then the fall of 1691, there's a problem. Every town meeting vote is written down in a book, the village record book, which we still have in the Danvers Town Library, and you can see the original penmanship. We also have records of Reverend Paris, where you can see the church records are all still written in his hand. With the town meeting book, you had the village clerk who kept it, and they picked a new village clerk. Part of what you did is you audited the book, because it's kind of loose leaf. You want to make sure you're giving the person all the pages. And when they looked at it, they found a vote from a town meeting that nobody remembered happening. Now, you can't have a secret town meeting. That's not how a town meeting works in a New England town. And funny enough, the only item voted on at this town meeting was the village changed their mind and gave Paris this land. Well, you can imagine the uproar among these, good New Englanders who think someone is ripping them off, which was apparently the attempt. And so right in the fall of 1691, just months before the witch hunt, we have real outcry in this community. Nurse's husband, Francis, is on the committee at the time, running the village. And what happens at town, they call a special town meeting, and they basically summon Reverend Paris to come and address the town meeting over this issue. He says it wasn't him, and it probably was not literally him who wrote this in the book. It was probably one of his friends or supporters, but either way, he's the one, of course, who would have benefited, so all eyes are on him. And what ends up happening is they essentially fire him. They cancel his contract right in December of 1691. Now, the first odd things that will occur in Salem Village are January, February 1692, so we are right about there. Paris is really only halfway fired because of the meshing of government and the church. Basically, town meeting said, we've canceled your contract, we're never going to pay you again, but only those core church members could decide to pick a new minister, and they don't. So throughout our year of the witch hunt, Reverend Paris is showing up to work, but there is no contract to pay him. And as winter comes, he has no source of income. His family might not make it through the 1691-1692 winter. This is a real problem. Winters back then were especially harsh. It's a period known as the Little Ice Age. Absolutely frigid. Rivers, waterfronts were freezing that we would never imagine today, just because of this little dip at that point. He doesn't have firewood. He doesn't have food. He lives in this parsonage with his wife. Several children, two of which will be involved in the story of the witch hunt, as well as 2 enslaved people who he apparently had brought from Barbados with him. He has a lot of mouths to feed in no way. What happens is we have a household that's really under stress, really existential stress that they might not make it. And what seems to happen is that the younger people in this household, they hear Reverend Paris, they hear his wife Elizabeth talking about this and sort of internalize it, because in January, his daughter, Betty, who's 9, and his niece, Abigail Williams, who had been adopted into his family and is living with him, begin to be unwell. And unwell in very strange and frightening ways. They start falling on the ground. They start screaming, rolling around. They point. They say that they see things that nobody else can see. They end up just shrieking. And Reverend and Mrs. Paris are, as you can imagine, they seem quite concerned about this. And what's interesting is Reverend Paris tries to keep this quiet. Other historians, again, especially decades ago, or especially if you see television programs about the witch hunt, they always paint Reverend Paris as the bad guy. That he's somehow the puppet master of the accusations. He's using it to go after his enemies. And he's definitely not a good guy in this story. But this is not all his idea. He's halfway fired, and having something wicked weird like this happen in his house is only going to get him all the way fired. This is not good for him. He does not benefit from something like this. And so he clamps it down for a couple weeks, so he writes. But it gets worse. It'll get worse. They say, the Betty and Abigail, not only do they see things, but now they claim these images, these specters are stabbing them, poking them with pins. They'll go on to say that they're being hit by, like whipped by chains. They'll go around on all fours barking like a dog. At one point, Abigail, the 11-year-old, will run into a lit fireplace and try to like crawl up the chimney as she's standing in the flames, and the adults have to run over and yank her out. So this is truly frightening behavior. When it gets a couple weeks past, it spreads, which is extra scary. And what happens is we have several other teenage young women who don't really live next door to Reverend Paris, but begin acting similarly. We had some that live on the Danvers-Beverly line, some that live on, well, what today would be like the Danvers-Middleton line, so like both ends of town. Really very similar, what they would call fits, this behavior, this happening. And as time goes on, as there's more, they're going to call a series of doctors. And it's one of the doctors, it was assumed to be the one who lived in Salem Village. We don't really know that for a fact. But the village doctor who cannot diagnose them with any medical problem. And his diagnosis, such as it is that they are, quote, under an evil hand, meaning witchcraft. Well, you trust your doctor, hopefully. And the doctor would have been one of the more respected people in town, one of the more, it's not really formally educated, but one of the more educated in the sense of experienced people in town. And so when he says this, it's taken up. We have these young teenage women having these fits continuing, and then we get to women in their 30s. We have some in their 40s. We'll eventually, before it's over, have a couple of men as well. And so it is not just a story of little girls accusing people of witchcraft. It is not. The first two might have been girls, I guess, by our standardization, but not all of those who have the fits. What happens next is that they are essentially grilled and questioned. You said you saw a shape. You said it hurt you. What did the shape look like? Is it someone you recognize? Is it someone in Salem Village doing this to you? And the reason they're questioned is witchcraft is a crime. It's a crime that is religious, but it's just a felony. It's a civil crime. It's a felony just like murder that carries the death sentence. And what the Puritans believed about it is they assumed you were doing, generally, what you were supposed to do as a Puritan. You're attending church, you're building up the Puritan church, you're building up Massachusetts. A witch is someone who's essentially switched teams. Instead of working for God and the kingdom of heaven, they've signed up to work with the devil. And you might wonder why they'd believe somebody would make such a switch. They believed the devil literally came to you with a contract and you signed your name. The Puritans were very legalistic. They also really like to sue each other. So they're really legalistic. And they often said the contract, you signed in red ink, implying that it was blood. And with that contract, you promised to do the devil's work, destroy Christianity, upend the Commonwealth. And in return, you got special powers. You're supposed to do it for what the devil wants, but when you're not, I guess like when you're off the clock, you can use it in your own personal life. And that's why they thought people would buy into this, that people would want these special powers to take revenge on someone or just become more wealthy through magical means. Now, because of that belief, when these people are unwell and diagnosed as witchcraft, they immediately jump into an investigation to find the person. They have to find the person. Well, what goes on is time passes and the afflicted, as they call those having the fits, do not name names. It really does not seem like something that's pre-planned. They're asked over and over again. It's unclear how they settle on these first names. It almost seems as though they may have been suggested names to them, the way that it just lines up and knowing what adults were asking them. They're going to end up accusing three women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, who are all on the outs of Salem Village for various reasons. Tituba was one of the enslaved women in Reverend Paris's household. She's there where it starts. She's not from here. She's not English. She was not originally a Puritan. There's a bunch of reasons why she'd kind of be on the outside of society. Sarah Good was poor, a beggar, quasi-homeless for a long time. And back then, they had really uncharitable views of those who were poor, basically assuming that was some punishment from God. So if you were poor, that did make you suspicious. And Sarah Osborne had trouble with her family. Her husband died, and then she married her live-in servant who had been living with them, and it happened kind of fast. And people thought there might have been something behind it, and so that's a scandal. But what happens next is they'll then accuse Martha Corey. Rebecca Nurse is this next person after that accused, and she is radically a different category from the first four because there isn't anything in her past that would lead her to be accused based on their views of society at the time. And that, when I had mentioned at the beginning, I picked a biography as a format. The reason I picked Nurse is, as we'll see, I thought by picking the person who seemed like the least likely case would expose more about the accusations, would kind of get us closer to finding reasons why. With these first three, I've kind of already told you the reason why they were accused. Its social views at the time don't really need much more investigation than that, unfortunately. But with Nurse, it is more of a mystery. And with these first few accused before Nurse, they at first will all maintain their innocence. They appear before judges for early questioning at the tavern in Salem Village, or some end up in the meeting house in Salem Village because they ran out of space. And this first appearance before the judges is them just trying to find out if the accusations against them are legitimate enough to go to trial. They'll hold all of them for trial. We have Tituba, who will end up essentially confessing, although it is not clear that she really understands what witchcraft is to the Puritans, not being from here. And you have to remember her position in society as being, well, very low as a slave, and she knows that these really important government officials are asking her very leading questions where you know the answer they want. So it is not that she genuinely or willingly confesses, but by giving some credence to the accusations, that will only lead to more. Here, when Nurse is accused, she's going to be accused by members of the Putnam household. The Putnam household includes several people, several women. Primarily, you have Ann Putnam Jr., who's about 12, and you have her mother, Ann Putnam Sr., who's mid-30s, definitely an adult, mid-30s. And with this household, it's unclear who first says Rebecca Nurse's name. It's not just unclear to me or us in 2024, but when somebody says that they believe Nurse is one of these specters hurting them, even at the time, people are unclear who first said it. Rebecca Nurse has a son and one of her sons-in-law that go to the Putnam household after she's accused, and they ask them who first accused Nurse, who first said the name Rebecca Nurse, and they cannot figure it out. Each person in the household says it was her, no, it was her, no, it was her. That's almost, I'm paraphrasing, but that really is how they write it down, that they're all shifting this blame. One thing that had been claimed previously is that the nurses in the Putnams had some sort of bad blood. I see absolutely no reason for this. They were on all the same side of divisive issues in the village. They were all pro-Paris. They were all pro-Salem Village becoming independent. And what's most noteworthy is little Ann Putnam is the one to publicly, or at least recordedly, mention Nurse's name first, though she says someone told her that name. And what she says is she saw an older woman who sat with her grandmother in the meeting house, the Salem Village church building. They call it a meeting house, not a church. So older woman sat next to her grandmother, and that's who she sees as a specter. Now, in the meeting house, you sat by sex and age, so everybody in her grandmother's pew would have been another grandmother, someone of the same age. So it's unclear how you get from this pew full of people to Nurse herself. She would have been one of about 7 sitting in a row, all of whom the same age. So that's unusual. But once she says it, it's taken up by all the other accusers. And that's something we see in many of the accusations. One person says a name first, but then all the others join in with that person, even if they had never mentioned their name before. Nurse's husband is key in her defense. We have other people in 1692, as the accusations continue throughout the year. with the first afflicted being January, February, nurse is the end of March that she's accused. Other families, some just will not stand by their family member who's accused. Other families will turn on their family member and say, yeah, we kind of were suspicious of them all along, which is not a good defense. Sarah Good, one of the first accused, her husband is questioned. And instead of speaking in her defense, he says, I've known her to be an enemy of all that is good. Making a pun on their last name, but also definitely not helping her case in front of the court. So you couldn't rely on your family even at this point. And the reason for that is your family members feared they'd be accused next. So Nurse's family will stick with her. When she appears before the judges in the original of the meeting house, she has clear conviction that she is innocent. She is elderly. She's 71. She is ill. She had been home ill for about a week at that point. We know she mentioned some stomach illness. We don't know exactly what. So she had actually been kind of out of the loop of village news at that point. And she just insists her quiet innocence before the two judges. And what's amazing is in the previous people who came before the judges, those previous hearings, the judges ask the most loaded questions, assuming guilt. They often would start, and this was, for the person accused, your one opportunity to nip the accusation in the bud before you went to trial, before you were sent to jail to await trial. It was your opportunity to defend yourself. And the first question they ask many of them is, how long have you been a witch? Not, are you a witch, but how long have you been a witch? So you can see what Hathorne and Corwin immediately assume the answer is. They ask similarly about Nurse, but they start to let up during her hearing because she's apparently convincing. And as she lets up, the afflicted accusers who are in the room erupt into fits. And after those fits, John Hathorne goes back to his hard-nosed questions. You can see how they're influencing the judges right in that room. Nurse's hearing is one of the best documents we have. We have, in theory, word for word, I would never swear that that is true because we never know if that is actually true, but we have a transcription of question, answer from that day. And the reason I'm a little suspicious is it is Reverend Parris who wrote it down, so the Nurse family will accuse him of not writing honest records later on, so probably not word for word. But with Nurse, even her, unblemished reputation, someone known to be a visible saint, sent to jail to await trial. Her family sticks with her. They will defend her to the end. They collect evidence. They collect petitions. Her husband, her sons. She goes to trial at the end of June. Not the first person put on trial. The first person put on trial is Bridget Bishop from downtown Salem. She was not among the first people I mentioned accused. The King's Attorney General could pick the order of trials. Nobody knows exactly why he picked Bishop to go first, but it kind of seems like if you're the prosecutor, Bridget Bishop's case was sort of the closest thing to a slam dunk case, and he probably wanted to start out the court with a conviction. Bridget Bishop had a really bad reputation, very few defenders, and so that's probably why she was picked to go first. After she's gone on trial, convicted and executed outside Salem, there is this sort of, if you were one of the accusers, like no going back from this. There'll be moments of doubt among the accusers throughout the spring, but that sort of solidifies a point of no return. And it alarms people in Massachusetts. What we often don't hear about with the witch trials is there's a lot of criticism of the witch trials as it's happening from people, not just ordinary people, not just family members, obviously family members of those accused, but at the highest, most educated levels, ministers in Boston, the president of Harvard College, a lot of discussion over whether these people were rightfully convicted, especially Bishop being the first one. It's not that they don't believe in witches. It's not that they don't believe that witches might currently be doing weird things in Massachusetts. They're just afraid the court hasn't proven it to the extent. That's their criticism. So after Bishop and after this criticism, when the second session comes and it's Nurse's trial, there's hope for a change here. They know that the first trial was criticized. They know that the judges were people had written to them and written to the governor with valid criticism. There's hope for a change, and it does not change. Nurse is put on trial there's a period of days where about half a dozen women are put on trial, including Sarah Good, one of the first accused. And all of them will be found guilty. Nurse's trial is unique. She has by far the best defense evidence because of her family, who sticks with her. And with this defense evidence, it's presented, maybe even to the judges, some of it, on the very first day she's arrested. It's presented then to a grand jury that still indicts her and sends her to trial. And then it's presented at trial to the 12-man jury who decides innocence or guilt. They find the Nurse family's evidence, which is petitions. It's evidence where people say good things about nurses, good character, basically character witnesses, I guess you'd categorize it. And then the third part of the defense evidence is kind of going on the attack and questioning the credibility of some of the accusers. The Nurse family will ruin the credibility of Abigail Williams, Reverend Parris's niece, and she won't testify in court again after Nurse's trial. They really point out times that she's been a lion, and so that does help people after her a little bit, at least in minds. The jury, once they leave to deliberate, and it was not in this meeting house, it would have been in a meeting house in downtown Salem. It doesn't exist anymore, the colonial courthouse for Essex County at that point. Now, when they return, they come back with a not guilty verdict that is a heart-stopping moment in the witch hunt. It is a moment where it all could have ended, because the evidence against Nurse is no better or no worse than the evidence against all of the other people accused. So what you have is a moment where if Nurse is not guilty, it means that probably none of the other people are too, intellectually, if you examine that as like a rational argument here. There is such an outcry in that courtroom, and it's not necessarily the outcry that sways the judges, but we have the Chief Justice at the time as Lieutenant Governor, William Stoughton. And he is startled. There's someone else on the bench who says, well, they're just going to indict her again, because they hadn't actually indicted her for everybody who accused her of witchcraft, just some of them. So I guess technically they could have done that. But what the Chief Justice does is he asks the jury to reconsider. And this is something that to us is, of course, wild, that you could do this. It was possible at the time. The judge claimed that not all the evidence had been given to the jury because some comments had been made in the courtroom that they hadn't heard. Still weird, but we are in the realm of legal plausibility at that point in time. The jury could have said, no, that's our verdict and we're sticking with it. But they agree to re-examine some evidence. The key moment here is while Nurse is standing up front in the courtroom, a witness is brought in the back door behind her. And she turns around and looks and says something along the lines of, why do they bring in her? Isn't she one of us? Or someone else writes it differently, isn't she one of our company? But it's written three different ways, but we can kind of get the gist of what her comment must have been. Nurse says this because that's someone else accused of witchcraft, and you weren't supposed to have someone charged with the same crime, like testifying against you. That was fishy. What Nurse didn't know is the person brought in had allegedly confessed to witchcraft. So when you say one of us, what's us mean? Or what's one of our company mean? And the judge can use that because if, as the judge claimed, that meant one of us meaning a fellow witch, that's a confession. And you can't find someone not guilty if they've confessed. That is the hook that they kind of get the jury into. The jury leaves, they debate, and they come back out. They're still not convinced. They still don't think so. And they go to ask Rebecca Nurse questions, which really her whole life will hinge on this moment. Being 71, being hard of hearing, being ill. She's been standing for the entirety of her trial. She doesn't seem to be 100% with the program, and her answers they don't quite line up with their questions, is the way the foreman describes it. She probably didn't hear them right or something like that. But because she didn't answer their questions, they will return a guilty verdict. And that will be her conviction. Her family is still sticking with her. They try to get the governor to step in. They try and try and try. But she'll be executed July 19th, 1692, along with about half a dozen other women. her case is so remarkable because it's after this round of executions you start to see more and more doubts. More and more people are concerned that this process is not going right. How could somebody as respected and clearly religious and reputable as Nurse be convicted? Something must be wrong. Despite that, there'll be another round of executions in August 1692, another half a dozen men and women that time. September, another half a dozen men and women, and it continues. But as it continues, there's more and more outcry bubbling up. The last thing I wanted to kind of leave you with is, with Nurse's case, something that I think is important is kind of how she's later remembered that sets her apart. And so it's kind of our last quick note. Nurse herself was presumed to be reburied on her farm. Once the witch hunt ends in October, the end of October 1692, it ends because they realized it was wrong. It's not like it's all over and then it takes them years to realize their mistakes. It ends because people are pointing out the mistakes, and it becomes politically untenable. It's politically unpopular, and so the governor has to end it, and the legislature votes to abolish the court. With Nurse herself, her family kept her farm in their name, and because her case sticks out so much, she's the first person from the witch hunt to get a memorial to her. Her case was unique at the time. It's unique in the decades later when her families are petitioning to have her name officially cleared from the court records, which they do in the early 1700s. Her case is at the forefront as we get to the late 1800s, which is really like the birth of the historic preservation movement. Her descendants gather to dedicate this memorial. They have picnics at the Nurse farm. That memorial in the center is the first memorial. The way it's often described, which I always think it's one of those impossibilities to prove, is it's the first time anybody in the Western world memorialized somebody executed for witchcraft. This goes way beyond Salem. That this is sort of a like first in the world moment in 1885, because they were so unwilling to believe that she is guilty, even generations later. When they dedicate this monument, there were 19 people hanged. She's just one of them. There was also Giles Corey, who was pressed to death. There were 5 people who died in jail. So out of 25 people, she's the only one at Salem in Danvers, but from the Salem event that gets a memorial. The others will not for over a century. She is 100 years ahead of them in being remembered. We see, of course, it's front page in the Globe. And if you look at that, I have a better picture of her monument. I took this in 2017. It was the 325th anniversary, and then there was a commemoration. So you see how like tall it is there? Well, I don't know who the heck the Globe got to draw this. I mean, it looks like the Washington Monument, and that is just not true. It is not the case. Maybe they didn't have enough words and they're trying to fill space here. In addition to, you might think, well, of course, it was the front page of the Globe. It's a big enough deal for that. This is reported around the world. It's reported in European capitals. It eventually gets all the way to Australia. It's reported in frontier newspapers out in the Dakota Territory, that these people on the frontier were reading about Rebecca Nurse's monument, as well as people in the Netherlands, in Paris. They're reading this story, and they also have bad images of the monument in Paris too. I don't know why. So that really shows how she is front and center in that memory. And it kind of continues when we think of the 20th century. Well, who did Arthur Miller choose as the main sympathetic character in The Crucible? He picks Rebecca Nurse, and although The Crucible, our 1950s play, changes some characters, Nurse's character is pretty true. He doesn't really feel a need to embellish her in any sort of way. We then, in 1992, have a memorial to the rest of the victims put up in Danvers, Salem Village. And then that's March of 92. And then later in 1992, or the 300th anniversary year, Salem dedicates their downtown memorial in August of that year as well. But it's not till 92 that everybody else is remembered. So clearly her case is somehow sticking out. Her case is more sympathetic. And that's really what was partly of what drew me to her case, was that idea of picking the least likely person and trying to pull out the most that we can learn about what is otherwise an event that is unimaginably complicated with so many people and a large cast of characters. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. I really appreciate you all coming out. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. That's good. Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that when she was being hung, she recited the Lord's Prayer, and then there was an outcry about not hanging her, or is that just like old wives' tale?
That was a different victim of the witch hunt. That was in August at that round of executions. They had the Reverend George Burroughs, one of the men, executed, and he did that like on the ladder before they hanged him because it was believed that a witch couldn't. He was a minister, noteworthy itself. Once Rebecca Nurse, a church member, could be found guilty, it really did open up anybody and anybody could be guilty, even a minister apparently. But yeah, they believed if you were a witch, you couldn't say the Lord's Prayer. And the way it's recorded is he does so. And Cotton Mather, the minister in Boston, is there and basically says he says something along the lines of, "That's the devil talking," and then they just turn him off the ladder anyway. Now that was, the ability to say the Lord's Prayer would not have meant you were legally innocent. That was really just a folk belief. But that's another moment that really stuck out to people as a "what are we doing here" sort of moment, just like Nurse's execution.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Dan. That was excellent. Appreciate it. I have a couple questions for you. One is, during your research for this book, were you actually reviewing like source materials, original materials from that time period, or is everything kind of like digitized now? Is it on microfiche and things like that? And the other question I have is, if you came into contact with documentation that you might have felt was inconsistent or not as credible, how did you determine that it wasn't something you might rely on, or like that?
Those are two good questions. So we, out of any 1600s historical event around here, we're really fortunate with the amount of records that we still have. We have those from trials, which again is really just the last stage of this story, is the actual trials. But we have the depositions that people had signed in order for the people to be arrested. We have the transcripts from those hearings before the judges. We have a lot, and we have the Salem Village records that we still have in Danvers, the town records, the church records, that we can really piece a lot together. Now, in terms of what kinds I had seen, I saw the Salem Village record book, I saw the church record book in Reverend Parris's big script, and the trial records, or really, they lump it into the trial records, but her examination document I found really important to see the original, because there is a not new, it was like 10 years ago, collection of trial records. It's records of the Salem witch hunt. It was published by Cambridge University, but it was witch trials historians a lot from New England, who of course were the experts on it. And they transcribed in print all of these records, which is useful because admittedly some are hard to read. And this is a problem for historians going in the future, when if people don't know cursive, then nobody will be able to read those. So that is a real history problem. It's a weird problem. And with Nurse's, her hearing, in that published book of records, what I had found based on the document is that it was missing a line in the printed version. Like, well, you can never just go off the printed version, even one done by experts, that there was a line on the back, and only the front was typed up. And it was an important line because it's presumably the last line of her examination. It's the last line on the page. It doesn't say afterwards and then everybody went home or anything, so I don't know if it's really the last line, where the judges are questioning her, and they keep saying, but these people say they see your shape coming to them. You're a specter. And the line from nurse is, if they see my shape, I know nothing of it. I don't. It's not me, because there was this belief that your shape couldn't go to somebody unless you had given the devil permission to like use your likeness and such. So just someone saying they saw your image, some people considered solid evidence. Other people would say, it's the devil. He's obviously playing tricks on you. Why would you trust the devil's evidence? That's intellectually inconsistent. So your second question, as to the how to weigh various sources, what's interesting is, in particular, I would say, Reverend Parris's records. That he, as the one who has transcribed some of this, he was hired by the court, by those two judges, to sit there in Rebecca Nurse's hearing and write things down. He will later go on to testify against Rebecca Nurse at her trial, which will lead to him eventually, after years and years of conflict, being run out of town in Salem Village. He's finally leaves. He still claims he owns the house, but he eventually leaves. And you have to take that into account, because then we see the Nurse family, who sues him like a dozen times afterwards for various things, calling into question his records. We also see things, for example, some of the evidence that led to people being arrested. One of the people who acted as a clerk is Thomas Putnam, whose wife and daughter were among the first two to accuse Rebecca Nurse. He was hired by the court just because, especially when many of the first accusers were teenage young women, they couldn't write. So somebody just had to write out the document for them. Unfortunately, he has a clear conflict of interest in this. And you realize, as other historians have pointed out, a bunch of those really kind of sound the same, which leads you to wonder, are all of these accusers using the same phrases, or is this really just Thomas Putnam talking, and that's not a viable source? So you really just have to compare it to others, but you always go back to the real piece of paper, which is amazing to hold the piece of paper from 1692 in your hand. And I, as a last note, was wicked fortunate that at that point in time, the Peabody Essex still had them. They're state records, well, now state records, public documents. And I finished up my last research trip a week before the pandemic started, and I was so fortunate, because I couldn't have done it without that trip, and so I would have been left in limbo as everything was closed. Yes.
What kind of feedback have you gotten on the book, positive or negative, as far as accuracy and that kind of thing?
Fortunately, very positive, and I'm really humbled about that, and I really think a part of that is just the idea that it's sort of its own category as a biography. I think that kind of sets it apart. It's not that it's definitely an analytical work, but as opposed to one that's more of a theme or more of a certain subject matter lens. But no, I've been very fortunate about that, and I appreciate everybody who's read it. Yes.
What relation was the judge to Nathaniel? And then when did they change the name, the spelling of the name? Was it Nathaniel who changed the spelling?
So the yes, it's Nathaniel who sort of changes the spelling. I'm not sure how many generations great-grandfather between them there, but they are related, of course. With Nathaniel changing his name, it's often said that he changed his name because he didn't want to be associated with John Hathorne. Maybe, but the name was probably actually pronounced Hawthorne, so him adding the W may have just gotten people to finally say it right. It may have just been a phonetic thing, or it could be his grand statement about his past that sounds like a great way to sell his book, The House of Seven Gables, that's about somebody dealing with their witch trials past. That almost sounds too much like a marketing angle to me.
And when did your next book?
Oh, I do not know. I do not have one in the mix. I've been doing reading more generally with the 250th of the Revolution coming up. And what's especially interesting to me is, in some instances, it's only one generation later. One of the people that defended Rebecca Nurse was another Putnam, and his son is Israel Putnam of don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes at Bunker Hill. That's just one generation apart, and I think that that's sort of an interesting, I'm not really sure there's a book there, but I think it's an interesting kind of comparison. Thanks. Yes?
What is the significance of the image on the cover?
Thank you for asking that. Thank you. So I can't wander. With a biography, you naturally would imagine that you'd have a picture of the person. We don't have any image of Nurse. My image of Reverend Paris, he really is one of the very few people that we have an image of. The judges have like paintings of them because they were rich and famous, but we have very few images. And so with Nurse, I think in particular my publisher was concerned about this. Well, if you can't put a picture of the person on the biography, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? Are you going to put a picture of the Nurse farm? Like, well, it's a book with a farm on the front. I don't know if that quite conveys it. This item is one of the few that, and I will use the word allegedly because I do think we kind of always have to be skeptical, one of the few direct items allegedly from the 1692 trials. This glass, this is a picture from the early 1890s. Frank Cousins was the Salem photographer. He photographed every historic house in Danvers and Salem and Beverly and such back when you had glass negatives that were like this big. It's a real undertaking at that point. And this was in the law library of the Essex Superior Court in Salem. They had a renovation a few years ago, and I haven't been back in, but they used to have a little display. It wasn't still this jar. And in the jar are pins. At Nurse's trial and at other people's trials, because the evidence that you're being hurt by a specter, like the accusers was saying, it's like just words. We have basically no physical evidence from the trials. Now, naturally, it's because it's not real, and of course there's no physical evidence. The witchcraft isn't real. But at Nurse's trial, there's a woman in her 40s, Sarah Bibber, who yelled out that one of the specters had stabbed her with a pin. Pulls the pin away, and she's bleeding like she's been stabbed with this pin, and she says, "Look, Nurse's specter just did this to me." Rebecca Nurse's daughter-in-law is sitting there taking notes. "I saw Sarah Bibber take a pin out of her dress. I saw her stab herself." And later tells the judge, turns this over to the judges as they're trying to get an appeal that they never quite get. So it was fake, obviously. But what they did is, these are some of those pins allegedly used at trial. I think some of them were probably, and so do others, 17th century paper clips. But some of them are different and may have been those pins from trial. So it's one of the few actual, in theory, physical items we have. And that's why we used that. We don't have any items that, like, personally, we don't think belonged to Nurse. With just history this far back, and being someone who's a common person and not a rich and famous person, but you don't have a lot of images, so we went with what could directly get us to her trial, at least possibly. Yes?
I've always been curious. So, what happens to the personal possessions of all of the poor victims? I mean, are they burned? Are they, I mean, I would assume they'd want to take all those possessions and make sure that none of them have the devil in them, and just, you know, as a bonfire, or what happens to all the personal, their clothing and their jewelry, or anything that are, you know, anything that they own? Only the victims of the witch trial.
That's a good question, and it's also one that we get a lot of misconceptions about. I think the way you phrase the question as interesting or concerned that the items may have had something to do with witchcraft, I'm not sure if I ever actually thought of it in that way or heard it written about in that way, whether their items were like suspicious after the fact. That is interesting. I'm not sure I really have an answer. But in terms of what happened, no, it was not a land grab. No, they didn't steal your farm if you're accused of witchcraft. That is not true. That doesn't make sense. First of all, majority of people accused were women who weren't allowed to own anything back then. So you weren't going to get anything. Everything was technically in their husband's name. So no, you weren't going to get anything out of it. There is a misconception that somehow people could steal stuff or steal land from those who were convicted. And it really comes down to the case of one guy, Philip English, big-time merchant. He owned the wharfs right along the House of Seven Gables in Salem at that point in time. Wealthiest man in Massachusetts. Him and his wife were accused. Well, he has a lot of ships, and he's really wealthy. He does get arrested and go to jail, but then he manages to get the heck out of town. He escapes from the Boston jail because he was very rich and famous. They let him leave jail every Sunday to attend church, and then he just didn't come back one day. He goes to New York, and at that point, the law couldn't reach you in that colony. Massachusetts could not send people to arrest you in New York. So it worked out. But there's a law on the books that if you flee from a felony charge, they can seize all of your stuff. Back then, being on the frontier, yeah, you could run away. So they needed a law to prevent you from running away. And if you thought you were going to lose everything, maybe you'd think twice about running away. So they did seize all his stuff. And in theory, it went to the colony. But when he comes back afterwards, after everybody's realized this is wrong, he wants his stuff back. And they say no, because you were legally charged with a felony. Nobody's disputing the fact you ran away and fled jail. Tough. And he did not like that. He did not like the answer tough. He tried to sue the sheriff. Massachusetts passes a law saying you can't sue anybody involved in the witch trials, which is super convenient for the Massachusetts government. And then he, at one point, after the sheriff dies, because he's the one who would have auctioned off his property, he would have been the man on the spot. He even tries to steal Sheriff Corwin's body for non-payment of debts because he claims he stole all his stuff. So that's bizarre and a lot of bad feelings. But no, normally nobody's stuff was taken. That is a red herring. Only if somebody fled. There's only one or two other examples of that, and it wasn't. It was just items in the house. So it wasn't any land of anything. Yes, sir.
Great presentation. In the Global article, was nurse's name misspelled in the headline or spelled differently?
Yeah, so Hathorn/Hawthorne, nurse is one, or all names at that point in time are basically made up. Very few people can spell. And so you just wrote the name the way you heard it. It's all phonetic. We see in the 1692 records, it's spelt nurse like we would, like the name of the profession. It's spelt nurse, N-U-R-S. It's spelt nurse, at least in one spot, N-O-R-S. It was just the way you said it. Everybody wrote it different. Probably it was really more pronounced Norse, like a longer U. Later on, some parts of the family standardized it as OU, probably just because that's the way you were actually supposed to say it. That's another misconception where people say they changed their name so that they wouldn't be associated with Rebecca Nurse. Well, if you're going to change your name, pick something a little more original. Adding one O is not going to differentiate you from the family. You're not hiding.
Another proof point, they never saw the monument either. So.
Right, yes. Yes.
I
Yes.
hear they refer to the women's daughters as junior. One of the women had a daughter, and they called her the same name, but her surname was they say Junior. They do that with men, but they don't do that with women anymore. You said it.
Ann Putnam Jr.
Yeah. That's something that it would have been written many different varieties of ways at the time. Her mother in more official records is just Mrs. Putnam. Mrs. is not an everybody title like it is today. Mrs. meant you were important, and they were important. Junior was something that you'd hear, or the junior, and the junior. At the time, and it's historians use it to differentiate the two still. You're right, that's kind of the only example I'd ever use. Junior, I guess we do kind of only use that for male names today. Yeah.
In our town right now, we have Elizabeth Johnson Jr. was just recently exonerated. So it's just a real, and they think that she got overlooked because she was junior. I don't know for sure, but they will do it anymore.
Yeah, I didn't even think of the North Andover example of a junior. I'm happy you mentioned that. Yes, that's a great example. Yes.
So her sister Mary was also executed. Mary Esty.
Yes.
Mary Town Esty. Yes.
Yep.
So again, this is conjecture on your part. There's a big deal about Rebecca's family building a monument to her. Why not her sister too?
It's a good question. Yeah, so out of Rebecca Nurse's, or the Town family, her maiden name, her sister Sarah Cloyce was accused, and really just the clock ran out and it all ended before her trial came. So she lucked out in that regard. Her sister Mary was executed in the last round, that September of 1692. I think one of the best documents from the witch hunt comes from Mary and Sarah as they're in jail. They write this document or have someone else write it, but it's their words, where Mary has already been convicted. Mary knows that she's going to be executed, and she writes a letter to the judges. And what she says is, basically, it's too late for me, but I know that I am innocent, and therefore you should think that other people are innocent too. And she's telling them to look out for the future cases. That she knows it's too late for her. There's no way that she's going to escape, but she wants them to look out for the other people. And I think that's kind of one of the most, I don't know, it's kind of like a heart-wrenching document there that you have this person who it's kind of like their last message. Why she doesn't get a memorial in 1885 like Nurse's, I'm not sure that I have a straightforward answer. In terms of Nurse, there is still descendants that were on that farm, so you sort of have proximity. You have that Nurse's case had always stuck out. Mary is just as innocent as Rebecca Nurse, so of course, but somehow never had that, and actually with her kind of like last message there, you think that would gain you more notoriety, because I think that's really important. With that, I would say the reason is probably the town of Topsfield's divisions. That Topsfield is a place where you do see issues between people in Topsfield, people in what's today Topsfield, but some people thought was Salem Village back then, and other people didn't think it was Salem Village back then, which is the problem. And you sort of had a town that was really divided over this. And I would say that trying to remember her would have been more of an issue because you would have had also descendants around of people on the other side. That's my conjecture. But in the 1800s, I mean, still today that's true, but especially in the 1800s, you might have had people still speaking out against it, whereas you didn't with Nurse. It is just a different community. Yeah.
Did her letter then help to save Sarah?
Not directly. Sarah was meant to be put on trial, and then they shut down the court, so she was still going to be put on trial. And she does eventually have her day in court in 1693. They established what we have today, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts highest court. And that clears the books of everybody still waiting. Because even when it's all over, the people were legally accused, and they do have a right to a trial, even though they're really now skeptical of the whole thing. So they kind of have to give everybody their day in court and then release them all. So that's what the Supreme Judicial Court does. That's what Sarah, she's in the second process. Well, that looks like it. Thank you so much again for coming out. I really appreciate it.
So thank you, Dan, again for joining us. We do have, I'm reading Dan's book now, and it is a biography. It's well researched, but it's so readable. So I just want to comment on that. So, if you're thinking, oh, witch trial book, biography, well-researched, may not be for me, but it is really, really well written. So we have copies of Dan's book out in the conference room, and he will autograph them for you if you would like. And also the bookstore. We have a lot of books on Andover witchcraft history as well. So, browse through what we have. What we're planning at the Historical Society is we're working on some speakers for next October with a whole theme of kind of the witch hysteria in October. So we have a couple of speakers that we're working on for that for October. So follow our website and see, maybe we can bring Dan back again, because pretty fabulous, Dan. Thank you. All right, thank you, guys.